Hey, Wicked. It's great to meet you here. Let's get right into the podcast. I wanted to ask you a few questions. I know you have a pretty different view on where transaction fees are going compared to the regular person. You talk a lot about that on your Twitter. Can you go into where you think transaction fees are going? What do you think the future of Bitcoin and mining is? All that kind of stuff. Would you be able to go into that?
Sure. Yeah. Hey, thanks for having me. Glad to be here and get right into it. Um, so I like to think of transaction fees in the context of a, fully adopted, flourishing network. And I think, this is kind of where we're headed, right? If you think Bitcoin's going to succeed and you think the world's going to entirely adopt it as kind of their monetary base layer, we'll have nation state level adoption, we'll have institutional level adoption, we'll have adoption amongst, as many plebs as can and want to take self custody. If you think that's where we're headed, then I think what it leads to is the realization that block space is going to be extremely, extremely limited for all of those participants, right? I mean, it already is, and we've seen this multiple times in the past. Most recently, just kind of with these random spikes in fees due to, like spam, right? You can call it whatever you
Yeah.
want, but data or spam or whatever, right? But like that's a very small number of users who, in a short period of time, demand a lot of block space, and as a result, fees spike, pretty extremely in those short periods of time. Now, what I think happens eventually is you know, that kind of activity, who knows if it will last? But I think the more, kind of interesting activity is like the long-term persistent use of Bitcoin as money and as a settlement layer. And so when you've got these institutions who are settling regularly with one another, you have nation states who are settling regularly with one another, you have high net worth individuals taking their Bitcoin into self-custody, settling from their custodians that they buy it through or whatever regularly, um, and then on top of that you have various second layers settling regularly, right? You have a whole bunch of off-chain activity bundled up into these giant settlements on chain, right? So you can think of this like the management of lightning channels, or I don't know if you've talked about it on this channel before, but like future ideas like arc that are going to require a, a large amount of block space in order to settle, frequently, right, itself. So all of this to say, right, you get these you get these actors entering Bitcoin, demanding lots of block space for their activity, and the only thing that can happen is a bidding war for the block space, right? I mean, there's no other way around it, right? Either you get a bidding war and block space just gets progressively more expensive, both in terms of dollars, but also in terms of Bitcoin until it kind of reaches some stable level, which we can maybe estimate and put some bounds on at some point, or you reach a unanimous consensus that we need to increase block size, which I don't think is going to happen. So like
No,
we've
me
been down
neither.
that road. We've been down that road. We know kind of like the outcome of that block size war that happened in the past. And we know that even if there were a group of Bitcoiners in the future that wanted to try to increase block size again, and by the way, this is kind of relevant because I don't know if you saw, but Jameson Lopp gave a talk recently about potentially opening up the conversation again to increase block
Hmm.
size. So I mean,
I
it's
saw that.
starting to kind of get its way back into the conversation, and I think it always will, right? We're always going to have this back and forth between Bitcoin's too expensive to use and um, you know we're not generating enough fees, and it's really hard to strike that balance given our constraints. And so a lot of people think, well, the easiest thing to do is just have some increase in block size or dynamic, adjustment in block size. But unless you have an immense amount of consensus around that type of update, you automatically create a shitcoin, right? It's a hard fork. So You
Well, can I
can't.
before we go further into that, can you explain to
Yeah.
my audience just in first principles? Like you're doing a great job. Like you're giving so much knowledge here, but I just want to make sure that they understand the basics of what you're saying here. Can you just explain what you mean by block space? Maybe with a graphic
Yes.
from Mempool or something. Like I feel like that would be really useful to my audience.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, thanks for reeling me in. Let me
Of
know
course,
if
no,
I'm
no,
ever
no
just
worries.
going off too much.
Yeah, yeah, no, no.
Okay.
What you were going into was really interesting. It's just I want to make sure that people know what you're talking about and they actually find value here because this is very valuable. So
Yeah, of course. Okay, so when we talk about block space, Bitcoin is a network that processes roughly, about 4 MB of data at its peak maximum kind of abilities per 10 minutes. Okay. Those 4 MB of data are bundled into what we call a block, and that block contains a bunch of transactions. Okay. And the transactions occupy a certain amount of block space, right? Requiring a certain amount of data. Blocks can exceed 4 MB, right? And typically they're actually typically a little smaller than that on average. So I don't know if we can see the block size here.
if you
Okay,
open it, you should
I
be able
forget
to.
how to do that.
If you click one of these, you'll be able to see it. If you click one of the blocks.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, there you
Okay,
go.
yeah. So if you were to click on one of these, you can kind of see right here. So this one's, 2 MB, right? So it's well under the 4 MB maximum, but it's still a couple of megabytes of data. Okay. Um, so when we talk about block space, we're talking about literally the amount of storage required to add one of these blocks filled with transactions into the blockchain. Okay. Um, we went through an entire war in the past called the block size war, where there was one group of Bitcoiners who thought we should increase the block size limit, making it, much larger or dynamic. And then there was another cohort who thought we should just keep it the way it is, or increase it in a smarter way that was backwards compatible. And we don't have to get down that track because it's pretty technical. But the point is, we had one group that really wanted to increase block size really big, and another group who wanted to keep it fairly small. And the group who wanted to keep it fairly small won out in the end. What we think of as Bitcoin is the original, backwards compatible small block version of Bitcoin. And then the other cohort who wanted larger blocks split the network and created a fork that has larger blocks, right? Um,
Yeah.
Now, in the context of fees, right? Because I think this is kind of where we wanted to keep the conversation focused. Um, when you have smaller blocks, it 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 makes block space more scarce, right? And Bitcoin is kind of just a system premised on the idea of scarcity. So it has scarcity in its monetary units, right? There will only ever be 21 million, but it also has scarcity in its block space, meaning there will only ever be, at most 4 MB of block space every 10 minutes. And because this block space is scarce, um, it drives users to value it, and we pay the miners in order to get our transactions in these blocks. Now, the reason why that is important is because miners require incentive to continue to mine these blocks, right? If they don't have incentive to mine them, then eventually they'll drop off the network, hash rate will plummet, and our network as a whole will be less secure, right? Less secured by proof of work, right? Fewer miners doing proof of work, a lower security budget, and an easier chain to attack. So we want to make sure that we're always going towards a future where miners are properly incentivized to continue securing our network. Currently, most of their revenue comes from the block subsidy. This is like this is the brand new Bitcoin that gets issued with every block. So it's the block reward that you typically think of. Initially, it was 50 Bitcoin per block, right? Then it got cut in half with the halving down to 25, and then 12 and a half, and then 6.25. And then currently, in current epoch, it got cut in half again, and now it's down to 3.25. 0.125 Bitcoin. That's the subsidy. The entire block reward is the subsidy plus fees. So actually, like clicking on this block, right, you can see that here in mempool.space. So the subsidy was the 3.125. For this particular block, the fees were, 0.042. And then together, the entire block reward was, those things added up. And just
So
from
the
this
way that,
block alone, yeah, go ahead.
well, I was going to say the way that I see it, the subsidy is basically just a way for the Bitcoin network to get the ball rolling, and then the
Yes, yes.
transaction fees are what take over everything else over time. Is that the right way of thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Yeah,
the
okay.
subsidy, it's exactly in the name, right? What is a subsidy? It's there to subsidize and bootstrap the network, right? It's also a very convenient mechanism to distribute coins, right, in a fair way. Anyone who wants to mine Bitcoin can use real energy, real proof of work, and then they get rewarded with newly issued coins. But eventually, those coins they diminish. The subsidy diminishes very rapidly because, again, it gets cut in half every 4 years, roughly. So that subsidy gets diminished very, very quickly. And most of the coins have been issued within a couple of decades of the network being around. And then at that point forward, you really need the fees to start taking over, right? I think I might be wrong on this number, but I think it's something like 99% of the Bitcoin will be issued by 2030 or 2032 or something like that. So like the vast majority of, all the Bitcoin that will ever be issued ever will have been rewarded to miners, in the form of this subsidy, um, within a decade, right? And then from there on, we really need to start incentivizing them with higher fees. So how do we get higher fees? We keep block space scarce and desirable, and we create bidding wars between users to publish their transactions in these blocks to properly incentivize the continuation of the mining of blocks and the securing of our chain.
That hit so many great points. I think you hit so many, you gave us so many little gems there. Do you think that something like, so I'm not sure if you know about it. A lot of people talk about it on Twitter. They talk about the uh what they called the security budget problem. Do you think that's a
Yeah.
valid concern for Bitcoiners, or do you think that's just like it's just FUD? People trying to push other coins. Like it's usually coming, so that just to give people context, it's usually coming from people who are pushing nano.
So in my opinion, I'm not concerned about it because I actually fear the opposite. I think that we're going to run into fees being ridiculously high. And we can talk about why that is concerning or what we have to do to prepare for that type of future. But the way I see it, if Bitcoin succeeds, right, if it is what we think it is, and it becomes what we think it will become, right, namely, um, the monetary base layer of the world, and everyone wants to use it, right, then block space will remain scarce, and there's only so much space for everyone. And so, this basically drives bidding wars, and what you get in the end is a very limited amount of space for a very limited amount of users. And then everyone else is kind of driven up onto second layers or, worst case scenario, driven into custodial arrangements, right? And so I actually think that, Bitcoin will succeed. And as a result, it will have extremely high fees, enough to incentivize miners to continue mining and securing our chain, but potentially, like potentially more than enough, such that it becomes kind of painful to use the network on the base layer, right? Just in terms of the fees you would be required to pay. Um, Now, you have to think of this in the context of, who are the future users that we imagine will use this network as a settlement layer. Think about the fiat billionaires and the institutions and the nation states and the second layers that are rolling up and batching, millions of transactions worth of off-chain, payments into one giant settlement, right? Those types of things. Those users, they don't care about spending, $10,000 worth of Bitcoin in fees, or, like $100,000 worth of Bitcoin in fees. If they're settling billions or trillions of dollars worth of Bitcoin at a time, then paying a 0.001% fee worth $100,000 isn't a big deal to them. Like that's actually a very, very low fee in all things considered, right? How much would it cost to settle $1 trillion worth of value between America and China right now, or America and Russia, or China and Russia, right? I mean, settling that kind of value without a counterparty, and actually settling the value, right? Not just like, you know, updating some numbers in a bank account, right? But like getting real value from one end to the other. It's very
Yeah,
expensive in the real world, right?
I
It doesn't cost 0.001% fee. So if you're doing $1 trillion and you want it to settle in an hour anywhere in the world, at any time, right? On the weekend, on a holiday, it doesn't matter. You'll be willing to pay a 0.001% fee. And if it's $1 trillion, that's a very, very high fee, right?
I think that's something that a lot of people confuse. So they confuse the Bitcoin base layer, which is giving you final settlement. Like it's like moving
Yeah.
a bar of gold, or like if I gave you this $100 bill, that's final settlement. If I gave this to you, you own this, and there's nothing that I can do to get it back unless I talk to you, unless I rob you, unless I do something to hurt you, or if I take it back in that way. When we use Visa and credit card and like MasterCard, all that stuff, they're not giving us final settlement. I think that's the confusion. That's the thing that people aren't getting. This is final settlement,
Yeah.
and this is what that it's like moving a bar of gold from one continent to another.
Yep, exactly. And that's the genius of Bitcoin, is it is a final settlement base layer. So it's a bearer asset money, right? Digital money that you can actually achieve final settlement between two users without the need of a third party or a counterparty. So it's like being able to send a bar of gold from here to anywhere in the world in a matter of hours. And once it's sent, it can never be taken back, right? It's final settlement. Um, so yeah, that's a very important thing to understand with like Bitcoin's base layer. And I think the reason why there's a lot of confusion around this is because up until this point, and even now, right? I mean, with fees where they are now, this is, by the way, this is the fee rate that we have right now. So it's very, very low, right? It costs a few dimes to submit a transaction to Bitcoin and have final settlement for your transaction. So even now, with these fees super low, you can still use, the base layer kind of as a payments network, right? If you're buying a few things for $100 or a few $100, paying a 30-cent fee to get it settled on the base layer is not a big deal, right? So a lot of people are still using Bitcoin in this way. So they haven't fully wrapped their head around kind of where it will be in the future when final settlements uh, are much higher value, right? Like when you're settling, instead of just a few $100 worth of value at a time, now you're talking about the network prioritizing the settlement of millions or billions of dollars at a time, right? And prioritizing those entities over the ones who are just trying to settle smaller amounts, because obviously the entities settling millions or billions of dollars worth of value at a time will be willing to pay much higher fees. And the way the Bitcoin network works is it prioritizes higher fees. So you can cut in line if you pay a higher fee, and you can kind of crowd out the lower paying fee people if you want to pay a higher fee and have your transactions prioritized. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
and
so
we
that's
like
kind of
we see it on this block right here. It goes to 609 sats per VByte. Then the next one that's going to be
yeah,
approved to the uncon. Oh yeah, there you go. 216 sats per VByte. I don't know
yeah,
what happened.
right,
Hey, can you even go into that? Like why are people paying so much in fees to have their transactions
yeah.
confirmed right away?
Sure.
What's the point of
Yeah.
that?
So if you click into the block, you can actually start to see kind of the all the individual transactions that were confirmed in this block, right? And they're color coded, I believe, by fee rate. So these ones up here are smaller fee rates, right? These are around 2, it looks like. Whereas the ones at the bottom are the higher fee rates. So it looks like we got, 25, and then were there some that were even higher? I thought there were some, maybe these ones down here. Yeah, so like 200 sat per VBET, right? This
Oh
very
yeah, there you go.
bottom
Yeah.
one.
Yeah,
Um,
217.
these are, I think these are, I mean, so a lot of the times fee rates are set algorithmically. So if you have a wallet that like determines what it should pay for a fee rate in order to make sure that your transaction gets confirmed in the next block, sometimes it will overestimate. So if it's algorithmic and it's not very good at estimating fees, then it will just punch it in at a higher rate than it needs to be. So I think a lot of these are actually just like bad code, right? It's bad algorithmic
Hmm.
code where like people are just overpaying fees because they're just running a script to estimate it and it's doing a bad job at estimating it. I'm sure some of these are also just fat fingers, right? It's like people
Yeah.
who meant to do 2 sat per VByte, but then they added an extra zero on accident when they were punching in their fee. So that could
Yeah.
also be the case, right? Um, but there are some instances where like, maybe someone like they don't really care about paying 10 sat per VByte as opposed to 2, even though 2 will likely get you into this next block, they want to be absolutely certain that they're going to get included in the next block, no matter what. So even if there was like a fee spike, an unexpected fee spike, they know that if they set their fee rate at like 10 or 20 or 30, they're going to get included. And currently that's the difference between paying a few dimes to like a few bucks, right? So they don't care about like spending an extra couple bucks to make sure that they absolutely get included in the next block. And that's
Yeah.
and that's exactly what we're talking about, right? When we talk about like
That's it.
cutting in line and not worrying about paying a little bit more because it's not a big deal, right? This is what we're talking about. So this is like, the people who are settling a few $100, willing to pay a few bucks in fees versus the people who are probably settling much smaller amounts who are only willing to pay, a few dimes, right? Because it only makes sense to spend that much in fees if you're trying to settle smaller amounts, right? And these people will eventually all get crowded out. That's my thought.
Right. Hey, you showed me a graphic before this conversation where it was showing us the percentage of the block
Yeah.
subsidy plus fees versus the total fees. Can you bring that up and just explain it to to the people watching?
Yeah. So this is kind of the historical ratio of fees versus subsidy. Okay. And it's given in a percentage form. So it's basically the percentage of the total block reward that comes from the fees. So if this is 0, that means that that block reward was purely subsidy. But if it was 100%, then and that means the block reward is purely fees, right? Obviously, we won't reach 100% until the subsidy goes to 0, which doesn't happen until 2140, right?
Mhm.
Um, but we should get pretty close to 100% far earlier than that because the subsidy gets cut in half every 4 years. So even with our previous block that we were looking at, right, we saw that the fees were coming in at around like 0.03 Bitcoin in fees, something like that, right? Even if fees were to stay at that level, um, you know, we would need, let's see here. I don't know if I can do this math off the top of my head really easily, but like 15 more halvings. And then at that point, that tiny, tiny little fee, 0.003, would be roughly equal to the subsidy, which would have gotten cut in half, numerous times to get down to that level, right? Now,
So
at that
at that
point,
time we'd be at the 20th epoch and we'd be in 2084.
okay.
15 with
Yeah. So, I
15
mean, yeah,
halvings. So just to give
so we're
people
talking, we're
context.
talking, yeah, we're talking about like way in the future, right? But
Yeah.
even well before that, the block subsidy is going to get, really low really quickly. So it's at 3.125 now. It's going to get cut in half again in 2028 and go down to 1.6 something. And then in 2032, it'll get cut in half again and go down to zero point 0.8 and so on and so forth, right? So you can see it diminishes very, very quickly. And even if the fees stay constant in their, relative value, or not the relative, but constant kind of in the value that they're bringing in, you would expect this percentage to kind of gradually float upwards and get closer and closer to 100%, right? As the fees just dominate the block reward over time. And this is definitely what we saw happening earlier on, right? So in the very first epoch, the reward was there, sorry, the subsidy was 50 Bitcoin per block. And so fees, were nowhere near that, which is why as a percentage they were very low. Then the first halving happened. The subsidy dropped down to 25 Bitcoin per block, and fees started to, account for a bit more, right? 1%, and then dropped back down into the point, in smaller percentages, right? But then this is the third epoch, and this is where fees really started to shine. This is also kind of the height of the block size war to kind of tie it back into that conversation, right? But what we saw during this epoch was a massive, massive inflow of users, a network which wasn't ready for those users, right? It didn't have it didn't have an option for them to do off-chain payments like Lightning. It didn't have SegWit adoption in terms of that update, which um, helps mitigate fees in some ways. And so what you saw happen was a massive fee spike. And this was, to give you context, like this was a lot of the argument for the big blockers. They were saying fees are way too high. No one wants to pay this high of fees to use Bitcoin. It's killing the network. It's making it so the network can't be used for payments, yada, yada, yada. And so this was like a big part of what was fueling that debate, right? Is should fees really be that high? Does it hurt the network or does it enhance the network, right? Does it add to the security at the expense of usability? Or does it just completely kill the network because no one can use it anymore, right? So that was like the debate happening, and we saw this spike here where fees at one point accounted for like 30% of the block reward. And again, this is during a time when the subsidy was 12 and a half Bitcoin. So I mean, there's a significant amount of revenue coming from fees alone. But anyways, after that bubble popped in 2017, then users stopped using Bitcoin, kind of in the same, FOMO-ish way that they were before. Fees dropped significantly, right? Activity pretty much died out. So this is where the security budget problem FUD, emerges, right? You get a drop in in users using the network, fees drop down, and then all of a sudden the security budget FUD, comes back, and everyone says, the network's not going to be able to sustain itself because it has too low of fees, right? Um, but then we get a halving, you get a spike in users, fees jump back up, and now you're back into the, Bitcoin's not usable anymore, right? Fees are too high. So we're getting this oscillation like back and forth between, are fees too high to use Bitcoin, or are fees going to be too low and not sustain the miners? And honestly, I think we're kind of just going to continue to oscillate between these two extremes as we get these uh, um, kind of like waves of adoption and waves of congestion in network usage. And eventually we'll just trend upwards, right? Until fees take over.
Yeah.
Like, I just
So
think
so
that's kind of where we're headed, right?
so I think you do a great job with explaining how people can protect themselves with UTXO management. Can you explain those concepts where basically what UTXO management is, why people need it, and how to do it, how to actually manage your UTXOs?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a good segue. Okay,
Yeah, this
so
this was a great intro, by the way.
yeah, awesome. So I will close this out and I'll open up this table here. Okay, so I mean, I know this is a lot of data, but let me just give you some background before we dive into this, into these tables. But basically, the way that Bitcoin works is it uses what's called a UTXO model. UTXO stands for unspent transaction output. You don't really need to know what that means, but basically, what a UTXO is a chunk of Bitcoin. Okay. So, in the same way that when you spend or send gold around, you send it in chunks, right? Either you're sending like little fragments of bars, or you're sending a whole bar, big bar, small bar, right? It comes in different sized chunks. Bitcoin also comes in different sized chunks. So when you see the balance of your Bitcoin account, it's actually a balance comprised of a bunch of these chunks of Bitcoin, right? Or a bunch of these UTXOs of Bitcoin. So with that in mind, what UTXO management is the management of your UTXOs. So making sure that your chunks of Bitcoin are the right sizes, are properly labeled and accounted for. You basically, you want to keep track of all the different chunks you have, where they came from, and then you want to make sure that none of the chunks are too small. Okay. The reason why that matters, the size or the value of the chunks, is because when you're making a transaction on Bitcoin, to kind of go back to the whole idea of block space, right? Each transaction that you're submitting is based on, or the data that you use for each transaction is based on the number of chunks that you are spending. So if you're spending a bunch of small chunks, your transaction fee is going to be very high because you require a lot of data in order to include all those chunks into your transaction, right? Whereas if you are just using one big chunk to spend, then the fee will be very low because now you require much less data to just spend that small little, or not small, but that large chunk of value, right? Because you're only referencing one chunk.
Can I actually
So
share my screen on my end just to
yeah,
show
go
a
ahead.
visualization of what you're saying here? Okay, one second. I'm
Yeah,
just
of
going to show
course.
mempool. Okay, so we see here on this most recent block, on this block here, we can see here this transaction has a bunch of UTXO. So each of these is a UTXO. They had to
Yep.
pay $2.37 because they had more weight in their transaction, more UTXOs, and they wanted to send them to these addresses here. So if we open this, actually, let's look at another one. So we can see here, this person paid 2.41 sats per VByte, and they had a bunch of UTXOs. This person paid a little bit more per VByte, 2.99 sats per VByte. This person paid 2.48. But if you look at the fees, the amounts that they paid, they're very different. So this one's like
Yep.
5, 6 times more. This one's 43 cents versus $2.37. This one's 26 cents versus $2.37. But if we look at if we go into the transaction, we can see the weight of this transaction. So we can see here 1.43 kilo V-bytes, I guess. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Kilo V-bytes?
Yep. Hmm.
Or kilobytes here. So if we compare
Yep.
this to, let's say, this one right here, it's going to be a lot smaller, 205 bytes. So it's a tenth or
Yep.
even less than a tenth. So yeah, keep going with what you were saying then. I think that kind of helped. Go ahead.
Yeah. Excellent. Yep. Um, yeah. So that gives some really good context and just real world examples of why it's more expensive to spend more UTXOs, right? When you're referencing a bunch of different UTXOs to spend them, then you have to pay a much higher fee. Okay. Um, So I mean, maybe we don't even have to get into this table because I think you've basically shown what I was going to get into with this table, and maybe this is just a little bit too much information.
I think it's
Um,
great to look at though. I think this is great information. If people want to take a screenshot of this or something, of course, I think this would be great because they can just use it to study up on. So
yeah, yeah, and I guess I'll say what it is so they can at least understand it. But
right.
it's calculating kind of the amount of data required for your transaction. I've highlighted here native SegWit transactions because most people are using native SegWit wallets. So these are kind of the numbers you would reference, right? So for every UTXO that you're adding, you would add 68 V bytes of data to your transaction, right? And the transaction fee is given in like a sats per V byte amount, right? So if your transaction fee is, for example, 10 sats per V byte, then for every additional UTXO you add, you have to pay 10 times 68, so 680 sats per additional UTXO, right?
Mm,
If the fee is 100 sat per VByte, if the fee
yeah.
is or sorry 10 sat per VByte, if the fee is 100 sat per VByte, now you have to pay an additional 6,800 sats per additional
Okay.
UTXO, right? And you can see how that like gets pretty wild pretty quickly, right? So if we get like kind of into these wild ranges, like 1,000 sat per VByte, which by the
Yeah.
way, that's kind of the range that we saw um, during some of these fee spikes, like during the 2017 fee spike, and then more recently during like the spam fee spikes, they briefly got into the thousands of sat per view byte. But now we're talking about like requiring 68,000 sats in a fee just to include one extra UTXO. So if going back to that example where we saw the person was doing a transaction with like 10 different UTXOs, that's 680,000 sats just for one transaction, just because they're using a bunch of UTXOs in it. And that directly eats into the value you're trying to transfer, right? And it kind of puts a threshold upon which like it puts a threshold as to how much value you can even transfer, right? If your 10 UTXOs aren't even worth 680,000 sats, then you can't even send them because at that point, it would cost more to send them than they're worth. So you literally can't even send them anymore when fees get ridiculously high.
Yeah.
So
I'm just gonna share my screen again, just to give more
yeah.
context. Like you were talking about the the spam fees. So just for
Mhm.
context again, we can see here, like there was one
Yeah.
transaction with $429,000 worth of fees. That's just crazy. That doesn't even
Yeah.
make
I
any
mean,
sense.
these are very extreme examples. And I don't expect it to ever get like this high sustainably, but yeah, these are kind
Yeah.
of, interesting edge cases where the spammers get, way over their
Like
heels here and like are, trying to get their
like check
transactions
the
pushed through in a very specific block. But yeah, it's crazy.
like check this one out. This one out right here. So they sent
Yeah.
70 cents worth of Bitcoin, so 1100 sats, and they
Yeah.
paid $510,000 in fees. That's
Yeah. Yeah.
crazy. That doesn't even make it. So you were saying 100,000, or sorry, what were you saying? 10,000 sats
A
per V byte
thousand,
would be
no,
the fee?
a thousand
Oh
sats per
yeah,
V
there you go, a
byte.
thousand.
I think a
So
thousand sats per V byte is probably like a good threshold that we
yeah,
may settle at in the future, right?
yeah. So like if we scroll down here, if we go further back, we can see here, even on this block, there were transactions that were 101 sats per V byte. That was the
Yeah.
lowest, so they were paying $9 for a transaction. Okay, let me stop sharing, and then you can go back to what you were saying there.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyways, yeah, I mean, so we're giving a lot of kind of good context, real world examples here. But ultimately, what we're trying to say is, um, right now, fees are very low. In the future, fees will probably get much higher.
Yeah,
And because they're very low right now, you should do your UTXO management now before it becomes super expensive. So, if you have a bunch of UTXOs or chunks of Bitcoin that are lower value, right? Let's say you've been stacking a bunch of Bitcoin and you take it into self custody and off the exchange fairly regularly. Maybe you do it like every day or every other day, or maybe even once a week. And because of that, now every time you take it off the exchange, you create a brand new UTXO. So because of that, now you have a bunch of UTXOs. Okay. So what you want to do is you want to um, first of all, get a Bitcoin wallet that allows you to view your UTXOs. So there's some good options. One of them is Sparrow Wallet for desktop. Another one is Nunchuck Wallet for mobile. And there's tons of tutorials on how to use these wallets with all of your different signing devices. So if you've got like a cold card or a ledger or a Trezor, any of the above, you can connect these to these kind of third-party wallet softwares, and they'll allow you to see the UTXOs, front and center, plain and simple, so you can kind of see what you're working with, right? So
yeah.
you want to see what you're
I
working with. Uh-huh.
Oh, I was gonna say, I think you have a couple of the tutorials on your channel as well, but like I think I want to go into, if you can, I want you to show people how this works. And sorry, just keep going with what you were saying, but yeah, I want you to show people how this works. I think that's really important.
Sure. Yeah, so we can get into that real quick.
Perfect.
Let's see. Yeah, I've got maybe about 15 to 20 more minutes, so we can kind of close out with that
Yeah,
then.
awesome.
So yeah, I think this is probably best shown if I just show a testnet wallet that I have up. Okay.
Yeah,
Um, So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up mempool.space and testnet just so we can get our bearings here and see what the landscape is for this. So you can actually look at mempool.space with these different uh, versions of Bitcoin. So mainnet is the one that we all use, right? That's the one that has actual value. And then these other networks that are part of Bitcoin are like testing grounds, right? And so they work in the same way that Bitcoin works, but they use um, you know value. They use UTXOs that have no real value, right? So you can do testing in them if you want. So I have some testnet sats in testnet 3. So if we look at testnet 3 right now, this is actually
Wow.
pretty relevant because, yeah, fees in testnet 3 are through the roof, right? And the reason why is because this network is actually getting deprecated. And so right now, like people are, they don't care about spending all of their testnet sats because they know that like they're all going to go away pretty soon anyways. So people are just, trying to get their testing done while they can before everyone moves on to testnet 4. But this is like kind of maybe it's peering into the future a bit because it's showing what the network looks like when it has tons and tons of users and they're kind of fee insensitive, right? They don't care about spending tons of Bitcoin in order to get their transactions pushed through. So yeah, so in testnet 3, fee rates are in the thousands of sats per vbyte, kind of what I was saying, we might settle that on mainnet in the future. But yeah, so anyways, and just to remind the audience here, testnet sats are worthless. So when I show you this testnet wallet, don't get fooled into thinking I have a bunch of real Bitcoin. Like this is testnet Bitcoin, all right? Yeah. So anyways, this is one of my testnet wallets. Okay, I've got like 5 testnet Bitcoin in it, and I do a bunch of like testing transactions. Right? I'll do like um, I'll test different apps using testnet if they allow it. I'll do different things like testing RBF transactions and whatnot, right? So you can do all the same things you can do in mainnet, but on testnet, and you don't have to put real value up at risk. So it's really nice to use in that way.
And it looks
But
almost exactly the same. So like if you go to the real one
yeah,
and you go and you
exactly.
use this one, they look exactly the same. So the tutorial
Yep.
that you're going to see here from Wicked is going to be exactly the same way that you do it on regular Bitcoin with let's say Sparrow Wallet. This is Sparrow Wallet, by the way.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, so this is Sparrow Wallet. It's a desktop wallet. So if you want to use it, make sure you download the desktop version because there is no mobile version. So if you download that, you're getting scammed. Um, but yeah, so Sparrow Wallet, you can download it at sparrowwallet.com. And basically, this is the layout. So once you have your wallet loaded in, the main tab is the transactions tab, and that'll just show you kind of your main balance and all the transactions that you've done with this wallet up until this point, right? Now, what's nice about Sparrow Wallet, which is what I was alluding to earlier, is it has a specific tab for UTXOs down here in the bottom left. So if you click on that, right off the bat, you see all of your UTXOs laid out, right? And you can organize them by the value, which is how I have it organized here. You can label them. So like, I know that these 3 UTXOs came from this tap signer, testing that I was doing earlier, right? So you can have a really good way of kind of tracking and labeling your UTXOs just to know exactly where they came from, when they arrived, and then how valuable they are, right?
And sorry, can I just give an input here? I think it's really
Yeah.
important to label these based on who you get them from, so that let's say if
Yes.
I think you've mentioned this before. I like your tweet on this. Can you explain what that means? I think you have a great way of talking about this.
Yeah, so there's two main aspects of UTXO management. The one is the one that we already talked about, which is kind of, looking at the values and making sure that they're all kind of above a certain threshold. I like to shoot for 1 million sats or more. So in other words, these ones would all be, too small. And I would want to consolidate these if this was my real Bitcoin wallet. Um, but the other aspect is privacy. So with Bitcoin being a public ledger, whenever you submit a transaction, everyone can see that transaction. So it sees all of the UTXOs that you've spent together, and they can start to um, paint a picture of who owns what. So if you spend, for example, if I did consolidate all of these together, right? Now the network and anyone who's watching it, they know that the person who owned this UTXO also owns this one, and they also own this one, and they kind of start to paint a picture of, oh well, these separate UTXOs, which we had no idea who owned them originally. Now we know that they all have one single owner, right? And you may or may not care about that, but in the context of, let's say you've been stacking Bitcoin from your exchange. And so you have a bunch of UTXOs that have come from your exchange. For example, I don't mind about changing the labels here just for demonstration purposes, but like, let's say I, had a bunch of these that I withdrew from Strike, for example, right? Let's say that I also did some work for Rajat and I got some Bitcoin, from him, right? So in the future, when I'm spending Bitcoin or when I'm doing UTXO management, I want to make sure I don't combine these UTXOs from Strike with this UTXO that I got for doing work kind of outside of the system, right? You want to keep this one private. You want to make sure that it doesn't get mixed with your KYC Bitcoin that came from the exchange because, as we all know, this is government tracked, right? So if you want to kind of keep your stacks private and separate from one another, it's really important to have good labels so you don't accidentally merge the histories of these UTXOs together. Okay. Okay, but yeah, with that, so kind of with that context, maybe just a quick example of how to do a consolidation in Sparrow Wallet. Does that sound good?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
that's perfect.
Yep. So all a consolidation is, a UTXO consolidation, all it is, it's you taking a bunch of UTXOs that belong to you and then sending them to yourself such that they get combined into one larger UTXO, kind of similar to like taking all your small little scrap pieces of gold and then melting them into a larger bar, right? Just so it's easier to deal with.
Yeah, great analogy.
Um, yep. Okay, so on Sparrow Wallet, you can kind of select UTXOs if you just hold down the command button and click them one by one. But let's say that we wanted to combine all of these ones together, right? It's about 2 million sats worth of value in total, right? If you added all those up. So once you have them all selected, you then click send selected down in this bottom right corner, right? That'll open you automatically to this send tab and with those UTXOs kind of pre-selected. Here you click on this arrow and you click on the wallet you're using. So this is my testnet main wallet, and it will have in parentheses consolidation, right? It knows that you are consolidating all these UTXOs. Okay. Give this the label. We'll just call it consolidation. Okay. And what you'll see, and this is actually a really interesting point, right? Because testnet 3 has such high fees right now, right? If you remember, it was like between 3 and 4,000 sats per VByte. When we consolidate all these UTXOs together, this is the fee we're paying. We're paying a fee that's nearly all of the value, and we're only
Oh, it's
receiving in
no,
return.
it's 5,000% of the value.
Well,
Wait,
it's
is that
it's
true?
it. I think that might
Oh,
be a
it's
bug.
it's I think the amount is wrong there at the top. You see under consolidation under label it says amount
It's it's
38,000. Why is
relative.
it?
It's relative. So this amount plus this fee equals all of the value, right?
Oh, there you go.
And
Okay,
then
okay. Oh yeah.
this percentage is a relative
Oh,
percentage. So it's
that's so
saying,
funny. Yeah.
yeah, the fee is nearly 5,000% higher than the value you're sending, right?
Wow.
That's what it's saying.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
perfect.
so this is a great example of when fees spike really high, you have to pay just enormous amounts of value just to move your Bitcoin. And if you have a bunch of smaller UTXOs, when fees spike, you end up spending most of your value just in fees to move your Bitcoin. And let's be honest, um, you know, you wouldn't even, I mean, you wouldn't do this transaction, right? Why would you spend 1.9 million sats to send 40,000 sats, right? The person accepting that, or even if this was a consolidation to yourself, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like
Yeah.
you're consolidating an amount that you wouldn't be able to spend in the future anyways, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a great example of kind of like the reason why you want to do this while fees are low, because if you were doing this when fees are low, like they are now, right? Fees are around 2 sat per VByte right now. Okay. So here you can see if we were paying roughly the fee that mainnet currently has, now you're only paying 1,000 sats in fee, and you're consolidating, the 1.9 million sats into a larger UTXO, right? So here now you can see the fee relative to the amount sent is much, much smaller, 0.05% fee relative to the amount you're actually consolidating. So yeah, this just like shows very clearly the benefit of doing this earlier rather than later. Just like how you don't want to really FOMO in to buying Bitcoin at the top during a blow off top. You also don't want to FOMO into doing your transactions when there's fee spikes. You might get worried, like fees might spike in the future, and you're going to be like, "Oh my God, I didn't do the consolidation earlier, and now I'm screwed." And you might make the mistake of doing it at that moment because you feel like they're never going to come back down, right? And so then you pay a really high fee. Um, but I don't think we're quite there yet. I think fees will kind of, again, like they'll be cyclical, right? We're going to go through these moments where they're really high, but then we'll get lulls and they'll come back down. So if you do find yourself, maybe you're watching this in the future and fees are currently going crazy, and you find yourself in this position where if you want to consolidate your UTXOs, it's going to cost you a ton of Bitcoin. Maybe wait it out, wait a few months, see if fees come back down. And then at that point, that's when you want to consolidate, right? When it costs less, when there's less people trying to use the network. And then that way you can be ready for the next fee spike, right? If there's ever an emergency where you absolutely need to spend your Bitcoin, you want to have these kind of larger, maybe like 1 million sat plus sized UTXOs to deal with in the future.
Yeah, this is perfect. Hey, are you able to would it be possible for you to confirm the to complete the transaction just so people can see? Maybe even
I
if you have a couple other UTXOs. I know these are going to waste anyways, but
Yeah, I actually, so I can't at the moment because I don't have my signer with me
oh,
for
okay.
this
Okay.
for this wallet. So I can create
Oh,
the
okay.
transaction. Yeah, and then so that would create it, and then you would finalize for signing, and then this is where you would like
Okay.
go through the process of you either like show the QR and you can sign it via QR or SD card, right?
Yeah.
I believe I created this with one of my cold cards, which I currently don't have on me.
Oh, okay,
So
okay.
yeah, so
Okay.
I wouldn't be able to sign it without that cold card. But
Yeah,
yeah,
okay,
so once
okay.
you sign it, then you broadcast it, and then it goes into the
Yeah.
mempool and eventually gets
And
included in a block.
that part is different for every wallet. So like if you do need to look at a specific wallet, like for the audience, let's say for example, if you want to
Yeah,
look at it for Cold Card, if you want to look at for whichever other wallet, let's say Trezor or what other wallets are there? Blockstream Jade,
yeah, hmm
Tap Signer, is that a wallet?
yeah. Tap signer.
I
Yep,
think it's a wallet,
yep.
yeah.
That's kind
So
of
if
their
you want
own
to look at it,
wallet. Foundation Passport, Seed Signer. Yeah,
yeah.
there's all sorts. Yeah,
Yeah, if you want to, you can. I know there are tutorials for each one of them
yeah,
on YouTube. Like you can see the exact details for every individual wallet. But this showed you. I think you did a great job, Wicked, of just showing a summary of what this is, why it's important, why people need to do it ASAP.
yep,
Any last things that you think that my audience may want to know about
yeah.
this topic?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I think that we are still very early when it
Yeah,
comes to Bitcoin, where it's going, and its adoption. And so, because you're an early adopter, if you're here now, you have to kind of stay in tune into what's going on with Bitcoin, right? You have to understand um, the various updates it's getting, the different second layers that are being built, and especially in the context of this whole conversation, how fees are being affected as a result, right? There will be a moment in time in the future where second layers will be built where spending on them will be very cheap. They'll have good security and privacy trade-offs. and you'll probably get, a brief moment in time to start moving some of your Bitcoin onto the second layer in order to have, a cheaper experience, and being able to spend it. The space is still very dynamic. It's changing all the time. And as an early adopter, you just have to be kind of tied in and nimble with the way you use Bitcoin, right? You want to jump at the opportunity to use it when it's cheap. You want to, keep your head on your shoulders and don't freak out when it gets super expensive to use. That happens sometimes. Just kind of, stay put and wait for it to get cheaper again. I'm sure it will eventually. Um, but yeah, like, take all this information, try to learn as much as you can about it, um, and then start to look at your UTXOs and look into UTXO management, consolidating your smaller ones and all that. So that's what I'd say.
That's great, man. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This was really useful. I even learned a couple of things here, which is great. I'm always open to learning new concepts on this. Thank you so much for your time, man. And you have your links there on the screen, W_S_Bitcoin on Twitter, and then you have Wicked Smart Bitcoin on YouTube. Anywhere else that people can find you?
No, those are the two
Those
places.
are okay.
Yep. If you catch me on Twitter, I'm posting there all the time, posting content, running. I run a self-custody Q&A space every once in a while in the mornings. So, if you have any specific questions, as it relates to UTXO management, and you want to ask in person, feel free to stop by one of those spaces and hop up on stage and ask. Yeah, that'd be awesome. So yeah, whenever you catch me
That's
over
you.
there, I'll be available to answer. Yep.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And Wicked has these great graphics. These are so cool. Like they're so informative. Go through his Twitter. Honestly, it's so useful. There's so much information on here that you'd find amazing and just it blows my mind whenever I go on this guy's Twitter account and I just learn something new. So yeah,
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
awesome, man. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate your time. Next time.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.